Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohail Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast.
Okay, so thank you, Yvonne. So I think we discussed quite a number of those things. Maybe we just again go through who you are and then.
So I guess to give you a bit of a background about who I am a co-founder and COO at the moment of a startup called Village Energy. Prior to that, I worked at Horizon Power. So I've had a background in the energy sector now for around almost 10 years or more, without trying to do the maths in my head. And I've also had a background working in really the sort of cultural heritage and native title sector previously, which is how I ended up working in the energy sector ultimately. So I've got an unusual background in that I don't actually have any engineering degrees. I'm not particularly technical other than what I've been exposed to over the years. My education was actually in cultural heritage studies and heritage management. And I came to the energy sector through a role working with Aboriginal communities and working with big development companies and mining companies in some of the remotest parts of Western Australia to secure heritage and native title clearances for big projects. And I ended up working in the energy sector in that role where new power stations were being built. Some of the remote communities at the time were being regularised. And they are really very, very isolated systems. And typically we're relying on diesel to power the communities, and the power was very unreliable and very costly. So I guess that was my first exposure to microgrids. And back then they weren't really called microgrids. It was sort of quite a new term at that stage. But there was a conversation around there needing to be a better way to do this, that there needed to be much more use of renewable energy. But there's a whole heap of issues that come with those sorts of transitions for remote systems, because usually people living in those locations have limited access to capital. There's not always a big utility that's looking after them. There's not people that are technically able to look after some of the infrastructure. And I think what I've seen over time in my role is a bit of a transition that's occurred in that space in particular towards obviously the adoption of more advanced technologies that mean that some of those greener and cleaner and more reliable energy systems are much more accessible now, because you can rely on things like automation, IoT devices, the Internet of Things is obviously a huge shift. And with machine learning now and artificial intelligence, there's a lot of opportunities to support some of the most remote parts of energy systems, systems that are sitting at the edge of grids or are the last mile of a distribution utilities network, to be able to use those technologies to do a lot of the things that have had to be done manually in the past, but do it in a very cost-effective way and do it in a way where we can begin to integrate renewable energy. So when I was at Horizon Power, we were obviously working on some of the issues that were being faced in remote and rural communities. It's probably more though around just there being a really high penetration of renewable energy. Because, you know, if you look at Western Australia, it's a bit of a mixture of very remote locations, which were probably more along the lines of those that I just discussed, where they're relying on diesel and things like that, but also quite large communities and town sites that are really centered around industry, like the mining sector, where energy consumption is really very high. The demographic is a bit more affluent. There's a lot of people flying in and out. There's a lot of development happening and building going on. And there was an awful lot of rooftop PV that was going into those systems. And that was posing some real technical challenges. I'm not sure what people's level of comprehension is around what happens to a system when you've got too much distributed renewable energy on the network. But what occurs is in the middle of the day, you just have way too much renewable energy available and not enough consumption. So there's a trough in demand, but there's a real peak in the available energy, and that can cause some real instability in the system and cause things like reverse energy. And then obviously in the evenings, when the renewable energy is dropping off, you have the issue where there's too much demand and there's just not enough energy available. So there's lots of issues that an intermittent energy source can introduce into a system. So we started to think about, well, what role does technology have in starting to manage that balance? And whilst I was at Horizon Power, we realised that really the problem around energy access and energy poverty is probably most acute in developing countries, where you have growing populations, you have energy infrastructure that is really less well developed than other nations. So there's huge amounts of capital that need to be invested. The infrastructure just isn't going to be able to meet, let alone keep up with, growth in demand. And usually the governments in those countries are already in a lot of debt, and the debt's just only escalating. So we started to think about how there might be an opportunity to work in developing countries, and that was really how Village Energy came along as a business. And Village Energy is really focused on what we've done at Village Energy is develop an energy technology that's really focused on that last mile of the grid and creating much more visibility for the utilities and making the energy system a lot more inclusive for people that are living in those locations. So we've tried to develop a business model that starts to think about how energy can be a real force for good, how it can drive economic development, how it can deliver social impact outcomes, and allow people in those edge of grid locations to participate in new ways in the energy system, because quite often the energy assets in a community are the biggest assets that that community will own, but they've never been able to participate in it. So we use artificial intelligence, not infrastructure, and we work directly with the utility, which is different to most people that we've seen in this space. We're not operating where there isn't currently an energy supply and they're using just diesel or other sources, and we're not operating in a mature market space where typically the solutions, the advanced technology solutions like smart metering, like distributed energy resource management systems, are really high cost, and they're not really that accessible for some of the more developing nations in the locations that we're looking at. So we've actually got a software and a hardware enabled platform. We install a IoT device, which is effectively a smart meter, but it has a lot of additional capabilities. And we install that at every consumption point and every generation point in a system. And it actually captures sub-household level supply and demand data. And then it applies some algorithms that we've developed based on machine learning and artificial intelligence to balance supply and demand in real time. So just so we understand exactly what I'm saying, because it's a bit abstract, we actually install the device, and then that connects to either different appliances in a home or different rooms in a home, and the end user consumer, so the person who owns that household or the business or rents it, gets access to an app, and they're able to prioritize their energy consumption by room or by appliance. So they might say, at this particular time of the day, I'm happy for my water pump to not be running, or I'm happy for my battery to not be charging, or I'm happy for my air conditioning to be a few degrees warmer, if that makes sense. So when we see those peak events in a system where there's just too much demand for energy, the algorithm kicks in, and it basically in the background is operating a dynamic price. So we base it on the levelized cost of energy, and it will then just disconnect momentarily certain connections in a system so that the balance is always kept. We don't experience outages that we would otherwise typically see in those events where there's just too much demand and the system can't cope. And then conversely, in the middle of the day, we can do the opposite, where we use the dynamic price, and we can actually pass that through to a customer and say, we've got loads of energy on the system at the moment. There's lots of renewable energy available. The price is a lot cheaper. It makes sense for them to be using certain appliances at that particular point. So that's when things like batteries might charge or pumps might come on. And all of that can be automated, because what we've learned is where you require a high level of engagement from people, the system is, you can't rely on the response as much as you probably would be able to if it's just completely automated. So we try wherever possible to allow the end user consumers to set and forget effectively, but they can still continue to engage in the system if they want to. So we try and have a solution that caters to the spectrum of different customers, including those customers at the very the lower end in terms of digital literacy. So usually when we go into communities, we see that around 70 to 80% now of people own a smartphone. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're great at using it, but they own it. So you see a real, again, spectrum of just individuals in terms of their level of willingness to engage or ability to engage with an app. And to be doing things like paying for electricity via a digital payment gateway. So we've actually allowed for anyone who owns a smartphone to assist someone else in their community, whether that's a neighbour or someone else in their household. So we still allow them to participate and engage with our platform, whether or not they are comfortable using a mobile phone app.
Yeah, I mean, what you have just explained, I mean, this could be anywhere else in the world, right? The whole world has a similar problem, but in your case, you are saying it's just in Western Australia, remote part of Western Australia. And the difference is that you are working with an utility all the time, rather than competing, helping them to enable these technologies in their system, right? Can we do a little bit of discussion on Horizon Power? Because I understand Horizon Power was one of the first utility who actually ripped off the distribution lines and made on-grid people to off-grid or microgrid. No, I mean, that's fascinating thing. I mean, no distribution company has done that yet, no?
Yeah, I think Horizon Power has always been a lot further ahead than some of the other utilities, just because of the geography that they were servicing. Mm-hmm. But I think, from Village Energy's perspective, what we did was take some of those learnings and then apply those overseas. So we moved away from Western Australia in our first deployments, and specifically targeted India in the first instance, because it's just such a huge population. I mean, when you compare the population of India to what we were dealing with in Western Australia, they just don't compare at all. And we also recognise that in India, the way that their distribution system is set up, there are obviously a number of states across India, and then each state has one or two distribution companies that typically have millions and millions of connections. So for them, the problem is just magnified just due to the sheer scale. And we actually, because we were Western Australian established as a startup business, we actually ended up working with Andhra Pradesh, which is the sister state to Western Australia. And we worked with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and signed a pilot project over in Andhra Pradesh in a remote community called Pagidaroy. And we implemented our technology in that village on one feeder, and that one feeder had around 130 connections downstream from it. And that feeder now really is probably one of the most advanced feeders in the world, just in terms of what we're doing there. So we've been able to implement our technology, and we've got renewable energy on that feeder now. And what we've seen, because we baselined before we implemented anything, we made sure we understood exactly what the energy experience was for people on that particular feeder. So we know that we've been able to improve reliability by 75%. We've reduced their bills by 9%, but we've actually increased their consumption, which is interesting. And we've also been able to do things like save the utility around 30% on their cost of supply for that part of their network. So we've been able to achieve some really really quite impressive results. And then we've subsequently got a second pilot that we signed up in the northern part of India in a state called Meghalaya. And that is very different to Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh is quite arid, it's very dry, very low rainfall. And then up in the northern parts of India, it's actually one of the wettest places in the world. So it's been a really good test of our technology as well, because we've actually had to develop something that can survive in extreme heat, but can also survive in very cold temperatures in extreme wet locations. So those two have given two pilot projects have given us a really good test of our technology. And yeah, so in addition to India, like you said before, Sahel, this really does apply anywhere in the world. And we believe it does apply anywhere in the world where there are remote or rural locations where energy is being delivered along long feeder lines, and the utility is effectively struggling to meet growing demand at the edge of their network, which is a lot of places around the world. So we've also been looking at countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia. So there's lots of other countries as well that we think there is a really strong use case for this technology.
Yeah, one thing I really like that you mentioned that in your Andhra Pradesh example, you saved 30% from the utility supply side, and you also saved money for the people while their consumption went up. So that means all these savings came from efficiency gain and basically optimizing, right? Using energy in the right time.
That's right, yeah, and using a dynamic price as well. And in the Andhra Pradesh pilot, we've published that price. And what I mean by that is that's actually what they're paying. So, and we actually take so those customers are still subsidised as well by the utility. So we're able to manage that subsidy exchange. But we've done it in a way that the end user consumer pays the current price of the energy on the system, and then the subsidy is applied afterwards. So they're seeing the real cost, but then they're receiving their subsidy. So it's not being masked by a subsidy, which is what is typically the case in most other locations.
So it did not distort the behavior, because the behavior is based on actual price signals.
Yeah.
And then you put a blanket subsidy, whatever policy and needs there is. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And we also shifted, and again, we can do it either way, but we shifted the consumers across to post-payment. So obviously, prepayment, sorry. So most customers, obviously, you post-pay Prepayment's not a new concept. There's a lot of places in the world that use prepayment for energy. But we actually found that because of the particular demographic of the customers that we're tending to see in these rural and remote locations, prepayment was something that they preferred, because they're actually prepaying on their own terms. You know, they can see what they're consuming in real time. They can see exactly how much balance is left on their meter in real time, and they can make top-up payments in increments that suit them. So what we tend to see is some customers who like to set and forget, they'll just put a large amount of credit on their meter and then leave it. And then there's other customers that will be doing much more frequent top-ups. And then we've got customers as well that migrate around a lot because they migrate for work. So they'll, you know, put a small amount on their meter and then they'll let it run down and leave it for a bit, and they'll go away and then they'll come back. So there's lots of interesting behaviours that we're seeing through this as well. And we were interested to see what the impact of COVID-19 had on the customer base too, because obviously a lot of places in India, almost all of them, went down into quite severe lockdowns for a period of time. And typically the way that energy bills are paid in these countries is they'll be handed a bill and then they have to physically go somewhere to pay it. There's not too many utilities that have set up digital payment platforms or allow their customers to pay over the phone and things like that. So because we've got an app and people can just basically make the payment through their app, or any other smartphone user can support them, lockdown didn't really impact their ability to pay too much. And it actually meant that where people were struggling financially as well, they could make much smaller payments as and when they could. And we're able to also facilitate things like additional subsidies or support payments just directly to a consumer's meter. So it was quite beneficial for those customers, but also for the utility, because they weren't sending their meter readers out because they were obviously worried about COVID-19, but we're reading the meters digitally anyway. So for those customers, it made no difference.
So how do you find the transition from a public sector utility working in Western Australia, then private sector, plus in challenging places in India, then came COVID, no? It's quite.
Yeah, wow. It's been a roller coaster ride. So Village Energy's been established for 3 years now. We're at a Series A raise point, and we were seed funded by an American investment fund called Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which was established and chaired by Bill Gates. So they're very much about investing in technologies that are going to have a big impact on climate change. So we were right at the point of kicking off our Series A when COVID hit. So that had a massive impact on us, just because, as you would expect, a lot of investment funds were not looking at new investments. They were much more focused on taking care of their existing portfolios. And they were obviously a lot more risk averse because everything was just completely unknown. And we're a startup that is implementing a combination of software and hardware in locations all over the Asia Pacific. So, you know, for us, it was a real challenge. And what it really translated to was us looking at, well, how do we continue to progress our pilot projects and support our existing customers, continue to meet the obligations of new commitments that we've made, whilst keeping our team safe, whilst keeping our customers safe. So we've done quite a lot of work with how we partner into a new location. So whenever we enter a new market, we always make sure that we partner strategically with CSR partners, with local NGO partners who can take care of a lot of the community engagement, because obviously we have a language barrier, if nothing else. And then also an implementation partner. So that could be the utility themselves, or it could be a third party, because we're effectively, the hardware we're installing is a smart meter effectively. It has a lot of local logic. It's robust in terms of its communications. It's meant to be able to operate in a disconnected fashion for a long period of time, because it has a lot of predictive and forecast modeling built into it. So it knows how to behave if it's isolated from the cloud. So it's really just a smart meter, though. For all intents and purposes, it's a sticking a meter on the wall. So any qualified electrician can install it. And we've found that just through having that partnership model locally, we were able to continue with our work and continue to support our customers without having members of our own team who are based in other locations having to physically fly. So, you know, I was flying to India every single month. I miss India immensely. I really miss being able to travel out there and spend time out in the community. But I do have a local team who's able to continue to look after things on the ground without having to travel too far. And we always had this notion longer term that we had to be able to move away from a heavy reliance on a physical presence, because just in terms of the sheer scale and obviously our objectives with how many connections we want to have installed over a relatively short period of time, digital engagement and digital deployment was always something that was going to need to be really something to focus on for us in terms of our business model if we were going to be sustainable. So I think COVID-19 probably accelerated a lot of that thinking for us. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of the journey, going from Horizon Power, where, you know, I think with any corporate business, as soon as you step into a startup, you're the purveyor of your own fate. You know, you make decisions and you pivot at the drop of a hat. And it is really fast paced, but it is quite demanding. And there are times when, you know, you think this is it for us, we're not going to be able to go any further, but somehow you manage to scrape through and keep going. And I think we've had those moments over the last few years. COVID-19 was a big one, but we're still here. We delayed our Series A, and we've got some additional interim funds that we've been able to raise. So yeah, it's certainly been an exciting journey. No regrets so far for me.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned partnering with community organizations and CSR and others. What about women entrepreneurship? Are you specifically looking at targeting women as well as a partner?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because that's something I haven't mentioned, but it is actually something we're really passionate about. Wherever we do roll out our technology, I sort of mentioned up front that we are quite focused on social impact and economic development. So part of our baselining and part of the way that we measure our impact is grounded in how we've been able to deliver employment opportunities, how we've been able to improve people's livelihoods, how we've been able to improve their lifestyle. And I think, you know, we see energy as an enabler of a lot of those things. And I think wherever possible, we always deliberately favour opportunities for women and children. So when we roll our technology out, there is a level of engagement that needs to obviously happen on the ground. This is just one practical example. So we like to employ people locally, and we do it. We try and do it in a way that it's almost like a gig economy. So, you know, there's a lot of business models at the moment that are popping up around how people can get employment that is available for them through technology. So we advertise jobs almost like through our app and give people the opportunity to be trained and go out and work with people in their community to explain the project to them, explain the meter that's going to go in, even to the point of training them up to be able to do things like support basic phone users to do top-ups, or become a green entrepreneur. So be somebody in the community that can explain rooftop solar PV and how they can get access to finance, because that's something else that we want to facilitate as well. So one of the other partners that we're looking at in our business model is a financier. So we can actually facilitate people accessing finance through our app to install rooftop solar. And that is something that wherever we can see a role for an individual, we always like to try and encourage women to be the people in their community that take up those roles, because we think that's really important.
Yvonne, what you just explained, I mean, this is what I was explaining last week to someone. We are designing a project with a similar theme and approach for Afghanistan. So similar, I think that the terms that you use, creating opportunities, improving lifestyles, give access and enable them to do it rather than just throwing technology at them, no? This is fantastic.
Yeah.
So you must have changed many, many lives. What is the customer base right now? I mean, how many customers are you? Where are you?
We've got our second pilot will be 500 connections.
Mm-hmm.
All of our agreements have the initial pilot and then an expansion that's contemplated as part of that pilot. And usually that's around 10,000 connections, and then it goes up from there. So I think, you know, for us over the next, obviously COVID has delayed things for us, but I think over the next 12 months, we've got big ambitions about extending our customer base to 10,000 plus connections. It could easily be in India, but it could also equally be in another country as well, I think. It's really just wherever we see the fastest traction. And we're able to install the solution relatively simply and quickly, and probably over a 3-month to 6-month period, demonstrate the types of benefits that I've spoken about, and then expand relatively quickly from there.
Yeah, because I work with a lot of utilities. Some of the countries have similar geographical and population density like Western Australia, so they can also benefit from those. So because the most efficient way to supply people is microgrid for those, it doesn't make sense to bring electricity from hundreds of kilometers away, right? I mean, that's what Horizon Power doing. Yeah,
and I think it's going to happen that way anyway, just because people are installing distributed energy resources just naturally. The system is going to have to adapt, and it either adapts because it's forced to and goes through a very bumpy ride, or we recognise that transition is well underway and embrace it and encourage it and find the right business model to do that. Because I think, you know, what obviously everyone knows, solar PV is a big thing, but equally you're going to have things like electric vehicles and batteries coming onto systems. And I think beyond those assets that generate or can dispatch energy, you've also got large appliances that can respond in a way to support the grid too, like pumps, like HVAC systems. You know, there's all sorts of things that consumers have behind the meter that can become part of the network. And I think that transition is going to happen regardless. So it's less about the utility leading that change and more about the consumer. I think the energy system of the future is going to be consumer-led and consumer-centric. And there needs to be technology that we're developing now that supports customers to make the right decisions and behave in the right way and rewards them for that, as opposed to penalising them. Because I think at the moment there's this struggle going on between the utility and the consumer, and it's probably just the utility struggling to keep up with this transition. And I think technology is available to make that transition a lot smoother and actually allow the distribution companies to be at the leading edge of it.
Yeah, it's like a taxi and bus companies versus Uber, right? Suddenly some of the consumers started bringing their car and started giving ride to others, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Then because electricity
we actually compare ourselves a little bit to Uber as a business model, because you know we don't own the roads, we don't own the vehicle, but at the end of the day, we take a role where we're aggregating resources between the utility and the consumer, and doing it in a way that everybody is better off at the end of the day. You know, the utilities operating costs are reduced, their customer service improves, they're a lot more efficient, and the end user consumer gets access to more reliable power, cleaner power, and power that's a lot more affordable. So, you know, I think the energy system of the future needs to be set up in a way that it's a win-win for everyone, whilst also delivering, obviously, renewable energy targets, because that's another huge problem, that climate change is something that is probably the biggest challenge of our time.
Yeah, I mean, once you bring the consumer into the game, then also consumer optimizes the appliances use, and being able to collectively do that. Like Victoria, I think still has it that with a flick of a switch, you can switch off all the hot water units in the entire state to effectively use as a demand bid, right? So you are doing that in a much more controlled way at the off-grid situation, and making consumers part of it. So it's not like a utility doing it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think consumers need to be part of it, because whether or not we are comfortable with it, I think demand response is going to be a big feature in energy systems of the future. And I think probably some of the biggest areas of tension are around consumers just getting comfortable with a utility controlling their assets. But I think if it's done in the right way, I think consumers, once they understand a problem and they understand how their assets can contribute to alleviating it, and they're appropriately compensated, I think that a lot more people would actually opt into those sorts of schemes. So I think, you know, we're thinking through at the moment, well, what should an app look like? And what should we be saying to consumers that entice them into effectively plans? So you would say, I'm happy to be part of this demand response plan. We know that at the moment utilities are, it's costing them a huge amount of money to deal with some of the technical issues on their systems to meet demand in the traditional way, and obviously with renewables coming onto the system in the volumes that we're seeing, negative prices are things that utilities are seeing a lot more as well, which is costing them a huge amount of money. If you can actually come at this problem in a different way and say, well, if we can encourage consumers to participate and we can alleviate some of those technical issues, we can share the reward or the revenue or the saving with that consumer and probably still come out better off. So, you know, I think it's starting to think about how we reframe the problem and how we involve those end user consumers in the network itself as part of that network asset base.
Yeah, but let's take a few steps forward. You know, some of those appliances will come with their built-in batteries. Homes will have batteries. So then this app that you have, that might be used as a platform to buy and sell electricity. Some consumers might say, hey, I have a huge roof. I can put a lot more solar here than I could in the past, and then if I can sell, and then you can sell even using your electric car, because that's also a battery on wheels. No, are you looking at those things on the horizon?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what we're doing now anyway, because we're a customer at the moment where a consumer installs rooftop PV, in the same way that we're basically facilitating the feed-in tariff, but we're doing it in a dynamic way. So it's a dynamic feed-in tariff. So a customer can actually say, I'm happy for my panels to export to the grid when the price gets to this level. So it's the same sort of concept, and we're doing that now, and that would extend to any other dispatchable energy resource such as batteries. You know, if for instance, a consumer is charging their electric vehicle, and there's a critical event on the grid and more energy is needed, we can automate in the background that battery dispatching to the grid as opposed to charging the vehicle. And conversely, you know, where we need consumption, where there's too much energy on the grid, we can also have the same sort of algorithm in the background that says, well, now you need to, we need you to charge your vehicle now. So, you know, that's exactly what we're doing, because we're running a ledger in the background. So we know the levelized cost of energy. We know what people should be getting if they're exporting. And the same goes for consumption as well. And we can manage contracts. So we have what we call smart contracts in the background. So we can actually have, for instance, if the utility needs a particular response from the distribution network, they can trigger a contract, and anybody that is signed up to that contract would obviously respond automatically and then be compensated in real time. So we've already got that set up as part of our solution. So I think what we're seeing there is that complete flip of the energy system from being centralized to being completely distributed.
It's already happening slowly in a distributed way. Maybe it will come together and catch.
Yeah, I think what we'll see is it will just become more and more distributed. You know, there's obviously a lot of energy still coming from central generating sources, whether they're fossil fuel based or renewable based. I think the energy system of the future is going to be a lot more distributed, and it will just be millions of distributed energy resources that are supporting the grid, that almost become that grid.
Yeah, I mean, not only that the consumption needs to be distributed, you can generate at source, right? Then you don't need to bring everything.
Yeah.
Now, what you tell a young entrepreneur who's really excited to get into this space, saying the transformation I have seen you in, Yvonne, when we met, you were a utility working, a utility thinking through meeting the needs of isolated Aboriginal communities and other communities, right? And then now,
and it's a difficult question, because I think a lot of it's just about attitude. A lot of it's just about not being afraid to get involved in new things, just getting connected to people that are working in spaces that you're interested in, and just wherever possible putting yourself forward. Because I would never have thought that I'd end up where I am now, coming from my background. But I've just tended to be led by what I'm passionate about, and thrown caution to the wind and just jumped in head first, and taken risks, because I think, you know, I did have that moment where I was at a crossroads. I could have stayed with my corporate job. Things were going relatively well. I was still really interested in what I was doing there. It was a great company to be with, but I could see that there was this other opportunity, and it was scary. It was unknown, but you know, I think that at those points in your life, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, part of being an entrepreneur is being willing to take those risks and just leap in and just give it a good shot. And it won't always succeed. You know, I think things have taken longer than we thought. We're 3 years in now, and we've certainly have had our fair share of challenges. People say to you when you first go into the startup world, oh, you know, you're going to be living on a shoestring, and it's going to be really tough, and there's going to be moments where you have to completely pivot, and it's all just going to come crashing down around you, and you're going to get punched in the face, you know, not literally, but figuratively speaking. And I think all of that is actually true. I think we've gone through a lot, but I think we're still here because we're passionate. And I think it's that passion that carries people through. And I think if you're the right kind of person, where you're willing to just knuckle down and really try to think outside of the box around problems, I think, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. It's not for the faint-hearted, though.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the cross-cultural issues, I mean, you must be facing a lot of cultural issues, no? What worked in
Well,
Australia, making that work in India is maybe quite different, no?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. How did you go when you first went over to India? And I think for me, it hasn't been as huge of a cultural shock, I guess, as I would have expected. And I think that's because I've come from the background that I've come from, in that, my education, as I said, was in cultural studies. So I sort of look more at, we're all humans at the end of the day. We all, especially when it comes to things as something as imperative to us as energy. Everybody who knows what it's like when you get an outage knows how people typically are going to respond. If you don't have access to reliable energy, that has just an impact on your ability to really be the best you can be. It limits businesses, it makes living difficult. And I think just on that human level, there's similarities no matter where you go in the world. So, obviously there's cultural differences, but when I sit with somebody in a remote community and I listen to their stories, they're very similar. Everybody wants to be able to give their kids a good education, have access to good health care. If their baby's sick, they want to be able to take them to a doctor. They want to be able to get access to medicines. And energy is always going to be a fundamental enabler of a lot of those things. So I think I felt quite comfortable. As soon as I'm out in those locations, I'm kind of in my element. That's where I'm happiest, is working with people on the ground. Not to say that there weren't, a lot of culture shocks along the way, because going into India for the first time, having never worked there before and not knowing the language, is always going to have pretty big challenges, just more logistical and practical challenges than anything. But I think when it comes to energy, people are all trying to head in the same direction. We all want the same outcome. We want to be able to transition away from polluting energy sources. We want to be able to use renewables, and we want reliable and cheap energy. So, no matter where I go in the world, those sorts of stories are the same. And I think that's what's exciting about what we're doing. It does translate. So, yeah, it is interesting.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Is there anything that I could have asked, did not ask you? You want to add something else?
No, I've actually really enjoyed our chat. And I think, I'm excited to be working in the industry I'm in. And despite not being a technical person, I actually really enjoy working in an advanced technology space, because I think no matter which industry you're in these days, advanced technology and innovation has a pretty big role to play. I think digitisation and automation and IoT is a feature in most sectors, no matter where you're working. And I think energy for me is particularly interesting because of that social impact element and the environmental side of things. So, I'm happy to have been able to share my story, and I hope it was interesting for people listening.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Sahel.
Thank you for joining us this week. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our show. Also, leave your comments and review if you enjoyed today's episode. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @shasni for updates. That's SHASNIE. Once again, this has been Energypreneurs, connecting you to the innovative opportunities in solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles. Stay tuned.